You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 534 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. I want to start off today's show by expanding a little bit on the big announcement that me and Will Porter made on Monday's episode of the show of the launch of our new show, Conflicts of Interest. Just so people know, the plan is to do a pretty much seamless transition between one to the other. The new show, Conflicts of Interest, will be 3 days a week, just like Foreign Policy Focus. And so Monday, August 31st, you'll get an episode of Conflicts of Interest, just like you would have gotten an episode of Foreign Policy Focus. Now, you'll probably have to eventually, subscribe to the new feed, the renamed feed. But hopefully, people are going to be mostly checking out the YouTube channel because we're doing a video element that I think is really cool, and it really expands on the show and what we're trying to do with it. So, things that people could be doing to help us out this week would be subscribing to the YouTube channel specifically, but also following the Twitter account and liking the Facebook page. All three of those will be linked on the show notes page at the Libertarian Institute. If you're, a big fan of the show and you're really interested in giving feedback on the new, thing we got going on here, the new project, we'd really appreciate if you join the Foreign Policy Focus Facebook group. And then we're posting sample episodes of Conflicts of Interest in there. You could get feedback on what you think of it and improvements that we can make before we officially launch this thing in about a week and a half. All right, with that, I want to go ahead and get into the content for today's show. The first thing I have is this trend that I'm seeing during the COVID epidemic, and it seems to be getting worse. There's a report at Reason which highlights some of the big things taken out of a Boston Globe article. And of course, the Globe is behind a paywall. So check out the Reason article. I'll link to it in the show notes page. And what's going on in Massachusetts is when schools are running into a student who's not showing up to enough and completing enough online work, in this state is called distance learning. Schools are then calling the Department of Child Services, whatever you call it in your state, but child services on the parents and alleging neglect. Now, the problem with this is, COVID has been very challenging for a wide number of people for a lot of reasons. For some parents, the school is essentially set up as daily childcare. And so, that's where your child went every day while you were at work. And once that was gone, it got a lot harder to, take care of your child, and especially if you were deemed an essential worker. So, if you're a nurse, somebody who in otherwise is, gain praise from everybody, but your high school age child isn't getting their work done, even though you leave them home alone, or even if it's a younger child who you're leaving home with your high school aged, older sibling or something like that, maybe they're not getting their work done. Not to mention that, and I was in the education system in Massachusetts in the spring, and I could tell you that districts weren't offering new content. And so the fact that the students weren't getting the work done was kind of meaningless, I guess, maybe you could argue that they would lose or, not retain as much with a longer gap between their education, but it could legitimately have been boring to an awful lot of students and not challenging at all. And so if they didn't want to just go through the motions of hopping on and doing something that they know how to do every day, does that mean their parents deserve a call from child services? Now, the problem here is there's the power difference between child services and a parent. And so, maybe if the school had just called the parent and in a completely, non-threatening way suggested, how can we make a schedule and form a routine to help your child get some work done? But you call DCF, who has the power to take away your kid. They come out, they say, we have an allegation of neglect. Most people, the meaning of neglect doesn't mean my kid's not doing their homework. It means I'm not feeding my kid, I'm not paying attention to my kid, something like that. So it's a hostile situation. You feel like if you answer the questions wrong, they're going to take away your kid. They probably ask intrusive questions just as a standard, but it have nothing to do with it. So maybe they ask if you've been abused by your parent. Well, that has nothing to do with what's going on, but DCF is still going to ask anyway. And then they're going to say, well, you know, if you put a schedule in place, it could really help. And at that point, the parent and the student have no interest at all in what you have to say because you're an enemy and a threat. And so that, you know, it doesn't help anything. I also assume that it really deteriorates the relationship between the kid and their school. A lot more distrust. How can I be honest with the people at my school if they could potentially call, you know, child services on something that obviously doesn't need? There was a case in Michigan that I've been highlighting on the show where a 15-year-old girl was thrown in juvenile detention for several months because she didn't do her work. And it's just not necessary and silly to be going this route with it. You know, if you're concerned about somebody not doing well, not doing what they need for their kids during the pandemic, then offer your help. Don't call the state on that. However, I think it's going to be a growing trend. And that's why I think more and more people are turning to more of a homeschool type education to provide their kids with, because allowing the stay in your home, even for something like this, is very dangerous. I've also covered on the show, you know, what happens now when kids are in a completely different environment. School is a, you know, very safe environment in that, you know, nothing is allowed outside. Also, some kid had I think a BB gun hanging on his wall, and the school called the cops and said that was equivalent to having a gun in school. That's absurd. In this Boston Globe piece, they highlight another story where DCF was called because I believe a 10-year-old girl had a 6-year-old brother who had a pretty severe case of autism, and he walked through her online lesson naked. Now, this is something that is very difficult to manage. I'm sure that the parent isn't like having this autistic kid run around naked just for the hell of it, but that, you know, the kid having some behavioral issues and doesn't understand, you know, the social norms and everything like that, is just doing what autistic children do. And now you have family services coming in the home, not to mention, you know, the schools in this case are like just absolutely absurd. Say an adult was running around naked, and I can't imagine that there's anybody who works at a school who can't tell the difference between a naked man and a naked 6-year-old. All right, so the next story I want to get into today is about TikTok, something that I can't believe how common I talk about that on the show now. But with the crackdown from the Trump administration on TikTok and everything, I think it's important to highlight that the new BlueLeaks documents reveal that TikTok is willing to give information on American citizens to the U.S. government. And so, you know, while I'm not saying it's not problematic that the Chinese have access to Americans' information on TikTok, I think that, like, on a personal level, it's far more likely the U.S. government would do something on TikTok that impacts you directly than the Chinese government. And so in at least 100 cases in 2019, TikTok gave information to the U.S. government. It's not clear if they had warrants in all these cases. And, you know, the users range from just some guy sharing stuff with his friends to people with hundreds, tens of thousands of followers. And then also, they were really interested in looking at what was going on during TikTok during the George Floyd protests. Both the Department of Homeland Security and FBI were monitoring it and alleging there was all kinds of nefarious plotting and insurrection going on TikTok. So if you're posting on TikTok, be very cautious about who's looking at that content. Not only the Chinese government, but the American government is very interested as well. The next story here, that was from The Intercept. This one also is too, and is by Jordan Smith. And I really enjoy what she writes at The Intercept. A lot of it is this kind of very detailed stuff about what happens in the criminal justice system, but really exposes why the system is so unjust. And so here, again, these are BlueLeaks documents, this, you know, massive trove of documents that were put online from police departments. And it highlights the training by this woman. I believe her first name is Renee Elroy. And what she claims that she could do is teach people how to identify liars. And so they'll do all these things like liars look in this direction, or stutter, or look down, or rub their nose, or touch their ear, or whatever. And, you know, I could train you to spot liars more easily. Now, it seems that the truth is this is a junk science. There was the most comprehensive study on this looked at 15,000 people, and they only found 50 of those, so of that number who were unusually good at identifying liars. Initially, they tried to reverse engineer kind of what these people did to see if they could figure out what was going on. But it seems to be that they were just able to get lucky. And, if you look at something 15,000 times, a certain number of people do get lucky. Nonetheless, police departments, including this task force in Wisconsin, get training from this woman. And she prices her course at nearly $2,000 per person and would not answer any questions that Jordan Smith had about her course unless she paid for that. So it's, very interesting that, this woman's able to take so much taxpayer money, but never, explain her tactics or what's going on to the taxpayer. And then the other issue here is that, you have an overzealous cop who looked at this, now thinks he could tell when people are lying, and he can't. And you say, I didn't do something. And the cop says, yes, you did. Yes, you did. Yes, you did. I know you're lying because I was trained to tell. Well, then they're going to push an issue a lot more. I'm sure it's, going to be something that'll contribute to false confessions. I mean, this is a major problem in the U.S. There's hundreds, if not thousands of people now who have been exonerated of charges by DNA evidence when they actually confessed to committing the crime. And so what happens, and Jordan Smith details this in her article, is there was this thing called the Reed interrogation, and it still goes on. But basically, the police departments assume guilt. They say, you did it, and they badger people with it. And what it does is it creates a situation where people eventually cave in and say, well, you have this big stack of information on me. You have all this evidence that actually doesn't exist, but they're saying it is. And so they end up confessing to the crime. This has cost states a lot of money, multi-million-dollar settlements, but more importantly, it has cost a lot of people their lives. Entire lives spent in prison, people death row and executed, people have gone to prison and died, especially because of bad, treatment and poor health care. And so, this just kind of is allowed to go on, and nobody really looks at this. And then, Joe Biden comes in with a bold new police plan where he's going to pay for more training. Well, all those millions of dollars of training, how much is going to go to bunk training like this that's only going to make the injustice in the criminal justice system worse and not better? The Pentagon awarded a $100 million contract to Doolittle Consulting. It's to organize and secure the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center. I'm not exactly sure what this center is working on right now, but it was a big contract, and I caught it coming out, so I thought I'd point out, and I linked to it in the show notes page. They're going to do this over 5 years. When they say secured, I'm pretty sure it means like more cybersecurity and not actually providing any like physical presence. It's also interesting, that they're giving $100 million contract of consulting. You would think that these are like kind of the services that West Point is supposed to produce in graduates, that their military officers are able to provide these services, but nope, just throwing away more money. Speaking of throwing away money, the Pentagon has for years been trying to award a contract for their cloud program. It's codenamed Jedi, and I've detailed this pretty much since the start of the show. The court battle has been going on where initially there are several companies bidding for this contract that's worth up to $10 billion. Microsoft, Oracle, IBM, and Amazon Web Services. I believe it's IBM that ends up getting the contract, but I'm not sure who ends up getting the contract, I should say. Anyways, the point is that there's corruption allegations and all that like going on, and now they're at the point where they awarded the contract, and then now they had to relook at it for legal reasons, and so they're asking for another 4 months before this is awarded. And it's one of those things where obviously this is a bureaucratic problem. A private business wouldn't spend 4 years trying to take bids on a contract and deciding who to award it to, and then finding out that their employees had accepted contracts with these other companies and were still advocating for those programs while in the Pentagon. All these major problems that they've had with the Jedi contract, and it's supposed to be this super important system, but yet they can't even build it. On the last show, me and Will talked about this case of Kevin Clinesmith, who was a former FBI lawyer who is expected to plead guilty to changing documents on a FISA warrant application to get a warrant on Carter Page, who was a member of the Trump campaign team, and then, have through FISA a couple Hobbs rule access to all kinds of documents in the Trump campaign. Now, me and Will highlighted the malfeasance and the illegality of that on the show, but there's a really good write-up on it by Andrew C. McCarthy. And when me and Will were talking on the show, we had actually pointed out that we hadn't seen a good write-up. So McCarthy does a good one. I'll link to that in the show notes page. But I want to highlight something that he points out that me and Will didn't talk about. And that is not only in the FISA court application, but within the Schiff memo that I think came out in 2017. First we had the Nunes memo and then the Schiff memo that were alleging, the legitimacy of the Crossfire Hurricane investigation and looking into the Trump campaign. Well, it seems that the Schiff, memo in Schiff should have had access to this information, that Carter Page was a CIA asset, not a Russian asset, and the CIA had passed this to the FBI, but they ignored it and went ahead and alleged that he was a Russian agent. And anyways, Schiff makes this exact same mistake, and it just goes to show how dishonest these people are, the elected politicians of the United States, and how they'll create all this strife within the United States, amongst our citizens based on lies. And they'll add to it and perpetuate it and mislead people. We have to always be very skeptical of our politicians. The U.S. announced they have banned all charter flights to Cuba. This, they say, is an effort to increase the economic pressure on Cuba. I mean, the embargo's been going on for so many decades now. You would think they would figure out that isn't the solution, but yet it seems like the Trump administration's kind of foreign policy solution to most problems is throw sanctions at it. The U.S. will require the dozens of Confucius Institute branches in the U.S. to register as foreign agents. I'm sure the Confucius or China will do something similar. So I'm sure China will do something similar to some U.S. institute or try to crack down in some way against the U.S. And this will, just lead to the diplomatic cycle, downward cycle that we're in with China. The U.S. also announced they're deploying 3 B-2 Spirit bombers to Diego Garcia. This is a little island out in the Indian Ocean that the U.S. uses from time to time to carry out airstrikes in the Middle East or Afghanistan. They also use it for show force operations against China. That's what my guess is these planes are going to be doing, burning a lot of fuel and wasting a lot of money flying around the South China Sea. When in that, no way benefits the American people. The U.S. and South Korea, I guess, delayed portions of their annual military drills and took others of it to some kind of remote distance setup. I'm not sure if they're all, on Zoom or whatever, but in some way have scaled down military drills going on. Hopefully this doesn't is scaled down enough to not lead to any increase in tensions between North Korea and South Korea. And, Moon Jae-in could continue on his effort to, bring a little bit more stability to that relationship. The U.S. aircraft carrier and its strike force group, the USS Ronald Reagan, carried out naval exercises in the South China Sea, of course, within territory claimed by China. There's this developing situation in Belarus, and I'll refer everybody to the Ron Paul Liberty Report, because I think Dan McAdams is really one of the best people on this and has the most background knowledge of Belarus and, the dynamics of the country, because he had lived there for several years, or at least for some time. I don't know if it was several years. Had lived there for some time, including during the 2006 alleged uprising in Belarus. And so he has, I think, a pretty sharp take on the issue. But just so people have some information, there was a recent election which the West is alleging that was stolen by the president. There's a protest movement against the president. He's locked down the country. He's reached out to Russia for help. It's at least alleged that Russia offered to give the U.S. or give Belarus some security help. And then, of course, the NATO access and all of this is pushing their own agenda, which is to get a more, I think, friendly NATO government in Belarus and pushing the protest movement there. I'm not sure if this is going to turn into like a color-coded revolution or a big thing. The president has now said that if a referendum vote ends up against him, that he would leave office, but that's the only way he'll leave. Yep, that's where we are in Belarus. And again, check out the Ron Paul Liberty Report for a whole lot more and better analysis on that. In Kashmir, 6 members of the Indian police, which is an occupying force, have been killed by militants since last Friday, and then 2 militants were also killed by police. It's, I think, about the 1-year anniversary now of the major lockdown in Kashmir. There hasn't been a whole lot of reporting going on in Kashmir, but when reporting does come out, is usually violence between the Indian police and then the occupied Muslim minority there. All right, so some news on Afghanistan that I want to cover. An article from Stars and Stripes. The U.S. military made $2 million in civil casualty consolation payments, so blood money, over the 5 years to Afghanistan. So every time the U.S. kills a civilian in Afghanistan, there's some, I guess, debate around we could give these people money. And depending on what year it is, it seems like they give money to several people, or they, give money to hardly anyone. The payment ranges are from $131 all the way up to $40,000. How they, determine somebody's life is worth a few bucks and somebody's life is worth tens of thousands. There's no clarity there. 2006 had the most payments, and those were 1.4 million in 300 payments. The U.S. also offers what they call hero payments, which through about that same time period were also $2 million. And then these are payments to dead members of the Afghan security forces. We now have reports, and this is an article from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com, that intelligence officials are saying that the Iranians are now offering bounties on U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan. So far, there's really no evidence behind this. And so if, evidence comes up, we could talk about, in one case, I guess this wouldn't be a surprise. I mean, I know the Taliban and the Iranians aren't necessarily allies, but at the same time, they seem that they would, have a very common enemy in a lot of ways, like in the United States. And how the U.S., assassinated Soleimani in Iran or in Iraq recently, and I guess we didn't pay a bounty because we did it ourselves. But if the Iranians responded in some way by offering bounties to the Taliban to kill Americans, I don't think that's a huge scandal in any way. This is the kind of thing that the U.S. ongoing occupation of Afghanistan, these are the results it produces. This is what the maximum pressure campaign against Iran produces. And while I don't want, people paying money to other people to kill people, that's terrible. The solution is to bring American troops home and to stop trying to starve all the Iranians to death. Also on Afghanistan, I've been talking about on the show this plan to release the last remaining 400 Taliban prisoners off a list of 5,000 that would facilitate talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban. It's reported that the Taliban have released all 1,000 prisoners that they had agreed to release. This agreement was, of course, made not between the Afghan government and the Taliban, but between the U.S. and the Afghan government and the Taliban in the peace deal. Initially, the Taliban or the Afghan government were pretty shaky about wanting to go ahead with releasing these 5,000 Taliban prisoners, but the U.S. applied pressure and they agreed to do it. So they've released 4,600 now. I think actually about 100 of this final 400. And then France, Australia, and the U.S., it's reported, are all objecting to the release of these final 300 prisoners, which from the U.S. perspective is the ultimate hypocrisy. I mean, if you look at this here, we told them you have to release this and we're going to condition our aid to you on it. And then they agreed to release the prisoners. And we say, whoa, don't. Now, the U.S., the fact that the U.S. is objecting, from what I could tell, is through like more of a bad channel. It was from an Afghan official that we got this report. But France is very publicly objecting to this, saying that there's some members of the Taliban that killed French that are on this list. But at the end of the day, France has let Afghanistan do what it needs to get peace. And France, along with the U.S. and so many other countries, have been involved in, for the past several decades. You include the Soviet Union in messing with Afghanistan, killing a lot of people there. All right. Next up, I want to talk about some new details we're getting on the Israel-UAE agreement to normalize relations. The first is that we had reports, and including the U.S. ambassador to Israel, saying that this could open up the UAE to receiving some arms sales that they otherwise aren't allowed to receive, because the U.S. maintains that Israel must get the most advanced U.S. weapons and then maintain a military superiority over all the Arab states. So, we'll sell them F-16s, but we only sell Israel F-35s. So some indication that maybe this will allow that. Certainly, I'm sure that like Lockheed Martin would be very happy to do this. Now, Netanyahu just came out and said that he doesn't want that to be the case. And so maybe there's a lobbying battle there to play out in the United States between Israel, the Israel lobby, Lockheed, and the UAE lobby. But it does seem like, that's something that's going to be pushed as more weapon sales coming from this deal. Now, another interesting story we have here is Trump's son-in-law and advisor, especially on all things to Middle East and Israel, Jared Kushner, says that Israel has either agreed or will not annex the West Bank until the U.S. gives the go-ahead, and that it would be some time before that happens. Now, some time could mean 2 weeks, but it sounds like something a parent tells a child, like, yeah, it's gonna be a while. So that was kind of my take on how it was worded and phrased. Maybe after the November election. I've heard rumors that Netanyahu is looking to hold another election coming up here in December, but all that's still just in the maybe category, and so it could be that annexation will come after that. But ultimately what he is saying is this is at best a postponement of annexation, and in no way did anything to change the ultimate fate of the Palestinians. And it doesn't change anything, because in reality that the West Bank is ultimately annexed, and the Israelis have all the power of the state over the Palestinians, and really it's an apartheid state at that. The last thing I'll mention on the deal is that Israeli officials noted that this could facilitate more deals with Arab states, and Bahrain and Oman were the next two likely to join. So speaking of the Israeli apartheid state, Gaza, the open-air prison run by the Israelis of about, I think 1.8 million refugees and 200,000 native inhabitants, have had to shut down its only power plant because Israel has cut fuel shipments. I think typically Gaza runs on a cycle of like 6 hours of power and then 10 hours without power. So now they're relying completely on generators, and that's a terrible situation. Just goes to describe the inhumanity of what's happening in Gaza. A UN tribunal released its final results in the assassination of Lebanese Prime Minister Hariri. This was back in 2005. Eventually his son became prime minister, was briefly kidnapped by the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and has eventually resigned his post. But the father's assassination back in 2005 was a huge deal. It kicked off a lot of violence in Lebanon. And so I think there was a lot of concern that this ruling could in some way incite a lot of violence. Ultimately, it seems like from the analysis I'm reading that the tribunal didn't make any bold claims. It held the person responsible that is widely agreed to be involved in it in some way, but who has since disappeared, responsible, and then concluded that neither the Hezbollah leadership or the Syrian government had any role in the assassination. I'm not sure on all the details here. This isn't something I've studied a lot, so I can't say if that's a fair ruling. One of the things that was highlighted in the tribunal that did make sense was that a lot of the data alleging that Hezbollah and the Syrian government were involved was this very circumstantial information around cell phones. The Syrian state media, and I guess now other outlets, have confirmed that there was an attack on a Syrian army checkpoint in northeastern Syria by the U.S. Now, there's disputes on what happened. The Syrian state media said two U.S. attack helicopters shown a possibility of an airstrike, but one Syrian soldier was killed, and that does seem to be the result. One killed, one injured on the Syrian side. The U.S. says that they ran into this patrol, then came under small arms fire, returned fire, and somebody died. Ultimately, the U.S. troops shouldn't be there in the first place. However, I do just tend to think that the U.S. would likely paint this in a fictitious way. But then again, there's no reason to trust the Syrian state. Either way, the solution is for the U.S. to leave Syria, because all we're doing is trying to steal Syrian oil. Last thing I have on today's show is an attack over the weekend in Mogadishu, the capital of Somalia, by Al-Shabaab. The attack was on an international hotel. This is, I think, a pretty common way that Al-Shabaab has carried out attacks, because I'm sure it, hurts business and targets foreigners coming into the country looking to invest in stuff like that. And so if this evolves, I'll keep a note on, but at least listening to that attack. All right, everybody, that was the show for today. Hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you go to the show notes page at the Libertarian Institute. Find the links to the YouTube page and subscribe, and then the Facebook. Make sure you like our new page, and the Twitter. Follow us there. We're gonna be putting out more and more content in the next couple of weeks. But we really appreciate it if you could do that for now. Also, we are looking at doing, Patreon, our donor tiers, stuff like that for the new Conflicts of Interest show. If you have ideas on what you'd like to see me and Will do, and then, especially if you're going to give us money, let us know. You would do that in the Foreign Policy Focus private group, and then any feedback on the new Conflicts of Interest shows, samples that we're putting out, we greatly appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.